Welcome to Connected. I'm your host, Haley Trimboli, and whether you're PhD curious or you are currently navigating your PhD program or you're wondering what your fellow graduates are up to, this podcast is your go-to for inspiring stories, actionable insights, and meaningful connections within the PhD community. Okay, today I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Dan Hiltz to the show. Dan has spent over 30 years developing leaders, designing innovative learning platforms, and transforming leadership development programs across industries. He earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Notre Dame, where his research focused on the effectiveness of subsidized homeownership programs. Dan has led leadership development initiatives for organizations such as Harvard Business School, the U.S. Navy Blue Angels, Mastercard Worldwide, Twitch, and the U.S. Army. He is the founder and principal of Leadership Squared, where he helps organizations maximize their leadership potential. And he also serves as adjunct faculty at St. Mary of the Woods College. We'll explore his journey through academia, his insights on leadership development, and how his PhD has shaped the career that he's built for himself today. So welcome, Dan. So happy to have you here today.
Haley, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. So, Dan, where does this podcast find you today?
Today I'm in my home office in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, which is a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. And as a rare thing in March in Kentucky, it's a sunny day here. It's kind of beautiful. Typically, the weather turns gloomy in November and we don't see the sun till April. So we're glad to have a decent day here for a change.
And know how that is. So happy for you. Glad you got out to enjoy it too. So, all right, let's just jump right in. So, you shared that you started your PhD at just 20 years old, which is pretty incredible. What led you to pursue a PhD so early in your career?
I think that the reason I selected sociology, well, the reason I selected PhD was that I was interested in sociology. And without a PhD, your career options in sociology are pretty limited. So as soon as I graduated from college, the next fall, I started in the PhD program at Notre Dame on a National Defense Education Act fellowship. That was a very nice fellowship at the time, fully supported my studies and my living expenses. And
Mm-hmm.
so I spent 3 years in South Bend completing my coursework and my master's degree.
Interesting. So, what led you to the University of Notre Dame specifically? Was it the grant that you had received or the fellowship that you had received that tied you to it, or was there another reason that led you to that institution?
I think the grant was probably a major factor. I also was very interested at the time in political sociology.
Mm,
And Notre Dame, when I applied, had a very strong program and emphasis in political sociology.
hmm
And after I applied and was accepted, the two professors who led the department in political sociology made a decision to relocate other places. So by the time I got to Notre Dame, that political sociology orientation had kind of vanished. So I switched gears at that time and refocused on evaluative research and program evaluation.
Okay, I see. What led you to sociology? Like what was your interest in it? Was it that you had studied that in your graduate undergrad programs that you had some questions, explorations within it that you would want to take into a PhD?
I just thought it was so interesting to see how group affiliations and social structures and culture influenced individual behavior and really guided social trends. So I wanted to learn more about that and understand the forces that act on us from outside that drive us to engage in certain behaviors, activities that form attitudes and opinions. So it was really just a matter of curiosity.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard that is the foundational skill if you are, or superpower, I don't know what you would call it, but to get through a PhD program is staying curious. And so what I wanted to dive into there was, what was I going to ask here? Well, let me step back and say, what was your vision for your career when you started your PhD? Like, did you see yourself being in leadership development where you are today? Was it that you wanted to teach? Like, what were you hoping, I guess, as the outcome of the PhD program when you started it?
I really saw myself working either in government or in a government contractor, evaluating the effectiveness of social programs.
Mm,
I didn't have a strong interest in teaching at all. I had no inkling that I would be involved in leadership development at that time.
mm-hmm.
That was really, I won't say the path of least resistance, but it was the most attractive path that opened up during the course of my early career.
Okay.
And so that's how I ended up where I am.
Mm-hmm.
While I was writing my dissertation, I was engaged to be married and was got married and I needed a job. So I ended up working as a what was called a computer programmer back in those days. I think now they refer to it as coding.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got interested in software development in a commercial environment. And that kind of opened up a lot more opportunities for me that guided my career from then on.
Yeah, so fascinating. I want to dive into that. The question I was going to ask you earlier that had lost my train of thought there was around, did you have like family, friends who had gone into a PhD program that sort of gave you the insight into, this is what it's like before you even got into it so that you had some familiarity, or were you really like trudging that path just through the curiosity, this, sociology, what you wanted to explore, the fellowship? Or did you have some of those like role models in your life that helped get you there?
I really didn't have any role models in life. Some of my undergraduate professors I really respected and admired,
Mm-hmm.
and they had PhDs in sociology. And so I thought, well, maybe that's the thing for me to do as well. So
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of how I ended up there.
I see. Okay. Did any of them act as like mentors to you to get into the program, or did you have like other influences or mentors, maybe not those faculty, that helped really shape your academic journey? Because the PhD is not a light commitment, right? Like if you're
Right.
going into it, you're pretty committed to learning and going in deeper into your studies than most people. So just curious to kind of understand the mentors, influences around you at that time.
They really did not serve as mentors. And honestly, when I started the PhD program, I did not understand the level of commitment required as
Mm,
a PhD. I say this about myself. I say this about many of the students who I see in the PhD program in global leadership that I work in now. I think so many people who are not familiar with the degree tend to think of it as a set of classes you have to take. And then at the end, there's this little thing called a dissertation that you have to write.
mhm,
And what I've come to believe over the years, both through my own experience and through observing others, is that the classes are just to help you get the knowledge and skills that you need to write the dissertation because the dissertation is the PhD. When I see people LinkedIn or on CVs have ABD actually written down, I kind of cringe because it's, you know, a PhD that's ABD is I kind of think of it as like a parent that doesn't have any children. I know all about being a parent. I just haven't been one yet. Well, there's kind of a big leap there where you actually have somebody to take care of, but
mhm,
I think so many students that are not familiar with that are not, don't appreciate the level of commitment that it takes to write a dissertation and to grow the body of knowledge
mhm.
that qualifies you to have a title of PhD.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really the key ticket because that's where you really are doing research on your own, right? Like you might have done it beforehand, but nobody but you is in charge of writing that paper and doing the research and analyzing the results. Well, you have some committee members who hopefully are guiding you, but at the end of the day, you're doing that work.
Right.
So so, so you get into a PhD program at Notre Dame, and what were some of the thinking back to that journey that you embarked on? What were some of the biggest challenges of your PhD journey, and how did you overcome them?
Probably just time management, really. Again, I was pretty young, so I had a lot of free time, which I didn't always use wisely. And I think that was something I had to overcome because unlike many of the students today, I was not working, I was totally supported in doing this.
Yeah.
And so thinking back, I could have been much more organized and much more focused on the things that I was doing.
Hmm.
Luckily, the class schedule kept me engaged for those 3 years. And then as the deadline approached for different milestones in the career, like the MA degree, hey, I better get working on this thing and get this done. So the structure of the program helped me in that regard. But
Hmm.
I would have done better if I had been more prepared to be personally responsible for my own progress.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big key aspect of it is deadlines, milestones. You get a lot of reading, you have a lot of writing. So there's a lot of aspects to the program. How were you as a writer? Like, how did you feel your writing skills were? Were you confident in that area, or is that something that you had to kind of work through when you were in the PhD program?
No, I was confident in my writing ability. One thing that is different from today is that, we had typewriters and real paper that we had to write. So you didn't have a word processor. So, the
Mm,
second version of a paper had to be retyped in its entirety, unless you
wow.
did cut and paste and Xerox some stuff together. So the mechanics of revisions were more difficult. So you tended to spend more time on thinking your thoughts through before you put them down on paper.
Mm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so fascinating. And you're in academia now, so you see the dissertation process like and what it looks like now, whether you're on committees or just talking to your students, like what are some of the big shifts or changes since when you were writing yours compared to what that looks like now for students and how they embark on that?
Well, yeah, I think that have so many more resources available to them, online research. One that I think we're all just beginning to explore is generative AI. What
Yeah.
is that going to do to the process? I don't think it's possible for generative AI to write a dissertation because of the research and the analysis involved in that. It can provide a lot of guidance to a student in writing his or her dissertation, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that plus just the availability of online resources for research is such an aid to current students, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a benefit and a curse probably for us at the same time. In one regard, we have access to so many resource libraries and research, and kind of on the same thread of that, like it can often feel a bit overwhelming to sort through it.
I think it can, and I think it tempts to the tackling bigger questions than they can really accomplish in the time frame that they're expected to accomplish. I see students now, well, I want to do a blended project, qualitative and quantitative, on these three questions. And I said, well, every question you put down there has to be fully developed. And so if you're doing a blended study on three questions, I look at that as three times two. That's six dissertations that I think you're going to end up writing. So I would encourage you to start focusing early on what it is you actually want to do. And I've
Hmm.
had students tell me, well, I don't want to waste my time writing a non-significant dissertation. And I said, well, any dissertation can be significant. And the most insignificant dissertations are the ones that never get finished because
Mm,
you can't drag them across the finish line, right?
mm,
So focus on something that can be not only a qualification for your degree, but also that can be a foundation for additional publications, articles, presentations, careers, whatever it might be.
mm-hmm.
Zone in on the thing that you're really interested in.
Yeah. Wow. So wise. I mean, I think like part of it is you got to get it finished. Part of it is the process though as well. Like you are kind of transforming yourself in this process. You're learning a lot of skills. What level of importance would you put on like the process of the dissertation, the growth through it versus, the outcome that you're getting of whether it's the outcome of the research, I guess I should say.
I would say that the transformation in the process is more evident
Mhm.
to an outside observer and probably is more impactful to the individual than the results of the research or the results of the publication. I'm sure there are exceptions to that. You read about people whose PhD dissertation becomes a best-selling book, for instance. Okay, that outcome clearly had some
Yeah.
legs to it. But for most of us, it's the impact that going through the process has on you as a person and as a scholar that really is lasting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I think quite the transfer. It's quite the journey to go through
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
And so when you were when in your PhD program, you were research focused on subsidized homeownership programs. I'd love to hear a little bit more around like what inspired your research on that particular topic. What were some of the takeaways or your findings? Like what did it lead into?
Yeah. One of the things I tell students now that when you're selecting a topic for the dissertation, there are really a couple things that there are three things I say you need to look for. One is that you need to have a topic that is interesting enough to you that it can sustain you through the dark times. And so, yeah, I still want to pay attention to this. Another one is that you need to focus on a question or problem that somebody else has interested in
Hmm.
because that's the only way you'll get some support. And then I think the third thing is that you have to have access to the environment or the data in which you can study that question. One of the analogies I use, you might be very interested in how the astronauts who are up in the space station get along with each other, but it might be hard for you to study that if you don't have access to the astronauts in the space station. So
Yeah.
think about something that you have access to. And I was
Mm,
fortunate enough to be connected with some people in the Department of Housing and Urban Development that had
hmm.
access to some data that I could use to explore the questions I was interested in exploring. And
Hmm.
so I think that for me, finding that data was something that said, yeah, this is a valuable research project because the government's spending a lot of money to help people buy homes.
Hmm.
Is it money well spent or not?
Hmm.
And, I was able to explore that in the South Bend community for my master's thesis, and then I had access to national data for my PhD dissertation. So
Hmm.
uh, it was kind of fun to see those two things play.
Wow. So I love these three topics. I love that framework that you just provided for the three things to think about for the dissertation is the interest in the topic, others' interest in the topic, and then having access to the data. And it sounds like this isn't a top to bottom list that you provided because maybe for your situation, you started in the data
Yeah.
you had the access to the data. So you started with that last one there, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. You had that data, and then from there was a need. You saw that others would find value in this, and then is that where your interest came in? Like, am I outlining that or summarizing that effectively?
Well, yeah, it is because I was interested in that program evaluation aspect of it as a career focus. So those three things lined up well for me.
Yeah, so I really think that's so valuable. So thanks for sharing that. Did you explore your questions? It sounds like probably through a quantitative lens, or did you take a qualitative lens approach to the dissertation?
Mine, but I'm a quantitative guy, so I tried to keep it quantitative, you know. I think it's
Yes.
funny now when I talk to students, their first, I hate statistics, so I'm not going to do a quantitative study. I'm going to do a
Yeah.
qualitative study. And,
Mm-hmm.
I have to explain to them, getting rid of statistics doesn't make your life any easier. There are a lot, numbers are give you a black and white picture, but the
Mm-hmm.
qualitative study, there are many shades of gray that you have to work through. And don't think that that's going to be easier just because you don't have to do a significance test on that. And
Mm-hmm.
plus, I
Yeah.
think that the tools available now to do quantitative analysis are so much better than they were. Now, I will say that SPSS, for instance, was available to us when I was a student,
Mm-hmm.
but to use SPSS, I had to come up with a deck of punch cards, take them to the computer center and feed them in. Now, of
Mm-hmm.
course, it's all done from your desktop, online, at home, or wherever you happen to be. I
Mm-hmm.
think even tools like Excel can do a lot of statistical and data analysis that make a quantitative study much easier than it used to be, much less intimidating to be.
Yeah, yeah, there's so much resources on like learning it too, I find now, and that you can, if you did have any weak areas, that you could help upskill yourself to get to that next
Yeah.
level. And so I mean, you're teaching in a global leadership program now. Do you find that most of your students are like leaning toward a qualitative approach in that field, or is it, are they leaning toward quantitative? Do you have both? Like, what's that look like for you now with students?
I think most of them are leaning toward a qualitative approach.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a couple reasons. First of all, the director of the program, who's very good, wrote a qualitative dissertation. So,
Mm-hmm.
when she talks to him, she talks about the benefits and the value of a qualitative approach.
Mm-hmm.
And she and some of the other full-time faculty members are much more engaged with the students in terms of time than I, as an adjunct faculty member, are.
Mm-hmm.
So they probably hear more about qualitative studies than they hear about quantitative studies.
Yeah.
I think that may be shifting a little bit just because of some changes in the composition of the faculty.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's so interesting that can, the influence that comes from the faculty at a university. That's when I talk to a lot of people who talk about their journey of choosing a PhD program, the faculty plays such a key role in it because you want to land somewhere that is maybe situated if you have that clarity already around your interests or your methodology or the approach that you might want to take to the
Right.
research.
Yeah.
So then you graduated, you completed your dissertation, you earned your PhD, and then what did life look like for you at that moment? Did you have a job? Were you on the job market? Were you scrambling? What did it look like?
Well, actually, I had a job. As I mentioned to you before we started, I was a computer programmer at an insurance company while I was writing my dissertation and when I got my dissertation. And at that point, by that time, I had moved from being a programmer to teaching new employees how to program. And
Mm,
so that exposed me more to teaching than my PhD program did. And I thought, hey, I kind of like this stuff. So that got me into technical training and technical training management. I switched companies again to be a technical training manager at a communications company,
mhm,
telecommunications company.
mhm,
And while I was there, I had the opportunity to take on additional responsibilities in management and leadership training within the organization.
mhm,
So once I did that, I thought, hey, I really like this stuff. This
mhm,
piqued my desire to teach, to be kind of a know-it-all.
mhm,
I can use the sociology obviously applies to leadership theory. And so
mhm,
this is a great way for me to be able to leverage what I know from my academic days to be in front of people and to help people develop and learn. And it was, I thought, a better lifestyle than being a faculty member.
Yeah, I mean, what a cool journey from being so technical in your role to then teaching that role and evolving to where you are now. And I want to unpack that a little, but before I do, um was there an expectation, and we were chatting a little bit this beforehand, was there an expectation that you would get into teaching once you graduated? Like, were your faculty or your fellow colleagues in school kind of surprised that you went into this computer programming role? Like, what was kind of the norm, I guess, for your cohort upon graduation?
Well, I think as I think back on it, which I've done in preparation for our conversation today, so many of my colleagues in the program that I was in chose non-academic or non-traditional academic roles. So
Mm-hmm.
we had people that went into corrections. One of my roommates ended up being the chief of police for the U.S. Mint, but all of us did some adjunct teaching as well as our day job.
Mm-hmm.
There
Mm-hmm.
was really never a strong expectation that we would go into a traditional faculty. Well, I guess probably half of our class, half of our group did, but the other
Okay.
half, we went a lot of different directions.
Wow. Yeah. So it wasn't like crazy that you were on this route or journey or
Right, right.
anything. So and so you went from a very technical role, computer programming, to leading and teaching other employees in that field. So, and I know you mentioned, there were some carryover from the PhD program. So I'd like to kind of dive into that a little bit. Like, what sort of things from the PhD program, whether skills, whether knowledge, behaviors transferred, or you feel transferred into a non-academic setting and maybe helped you be successful in your career development.
I think part of it were at the time, computer programming, coding was, not the field that it is today. And so there was a lot of mystery about being a program. Is it an art or is it a science? Is it a profession or is it an occupation? People used to say, well, you either got it or you don't got it. I never believed that. I said, no, there are principles here. This is a body of knowledge that can be codified and taught. So my first inclination was, let's figure out what the pedagogy is here to make this work and what the building blocks are in this skill or art or magic, whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
And so that got me to dig a little deeper into what is this technical skill and what does it entail. And I think that orientation carries over then to what's management and what's leadership. What is that a teachable thing? In your occupation now, what you do from 9 to 5, and based on your degree, that leadership is a set of skills and a body of knowledge, and leadership some people can be taught better than others, but leaders are not, don't all have to be born leaders. They can be taught to be leaders. I don't
Mhm.
think that was as well understood
Mm.
30 or 40 years ago.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So how'd you break into it? I mean, how, like, because you were kind of at the technical side of it, but like, what barriers did you find then with maybe going more into that space than the technical?
I think I guess we first focused on management training. So if you think of management as distinct from leadership,
Mhm.
what does it take to manage a group of people? And that was a little bit easier to break down
Mhm.
than leadership is because it's really, time management, project management, etc. So you start to focus on those individual skills, and then from there you start to see where the gaps are between those individual competencies and the ability to lead people and to derive value from your leadership skills as opposed to your individual contributor skills. I talk now to my students and my clients about, the leadership dividend. And in every organization, people tend to get promoted into positions of management leadership based on their individual competency as individual contributors. And
Mm-hmm.
I have to explain to people, you're not going to be doing that individual contribution as much. The organization is willing to sacrifice that in order for you to apply other skills to make all of the individual contributors who work with you more productive. So
Mm-hmm.
the overall production of your team is going to be greater than the sum of the individual parts, including your individual contribution. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to be willing to step back from that individual contribution that you're familiar with. And
Mm-hmm.
you're not in the coding business. You're not in the adult learning business. You're in the people business. And you're there to help other people be more productive and more successful.
Yeah, yeah, a whole different mindset shift happening there at that transition. So you have worked with a lot of organizations, some of which were mentioned in your introduction. What were some of the most, or what are some of the most valuable leadership lessons that you've learned from working with such diverse teams, organizations, people?
Boy, what a loaded question that is. I think that first of all, one of the leadership lesson I take away is that you're not going to be perfect. So you have to be willing to make mistakes as a leader.
Mm,
As a teacher of leadership, as you know, you have to be willing to help other people recognize the fact that you're going to be a work in progress as a leader, no matter where you are or how long you've been in that role.
yeah.
So give yourself a little bit of grace and be willing to understand that you're going to make mistakes occasionally. I think that the other thing that I have learned over time is that leadership really is a one-on-one activity. You don't lead giant groups of people. You know, People don't follow somebody way up here. They follow the people that are closest to them. So you have to help cascade that knowledge and that awareness through an organization to let everybody know that leadership is his or her job. It's not
Mm,
just the job of the person at the top. So I think the
mm-hmm.
whole concept of networked leadership and networked organizations is becoming much more accepted now than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Being willing to make mistakes is a key aspect of leadership.
Yeah.
What are some of the, just from your work, like what are some of the most common leadership pitfalls that you see?
I, I think I think the biggest one that I've seen over the years is that when people first get into management and leadership positions, they do that before they've received any formal training, right? You don't get into a management program until you're a manager. You don't get into a leadership program until you're a leader because
Mm,
organizations don't want to waste that investment.
mm-hmm.
So typically, I think when people get in there, they tend to see, well, if I'm a leader, the best leader I had was Joe Smith 10 years ago. So I'm going to act just like Joe Smith did. Well,
Yeah.
the problem is you're not Joe Smith. So
Yeah.
mimicking what Joe Smith did is not going to make you successful. You need to do what you as an individual, your individual talents and strengths play to.
Mm,
I'm a Gallup certified strengths coach. So
mm,
that experience has given me a lot of insight into the fact of how different people are and how each of those differences can be leveraged to accomplish specific goals, but they're going to be leveraged in different ways.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the pitfall of thinking that you can just mimic or recreate your leadership brand, your leadership skills and knowledge based off of those that you've been led by versus really sort of turning inward or understanding what makes you unique as a leader and being prepared for that ideally before you get into the
Exactly.
position.
Exactly.
That's why we need more training professionals and learning professionals in organizations.
Well, and I think, you have to provide more experiential leadership opportunities
Mm,
all along the way. And I think
yeah.
that even starts within families, if children and adolescents have to be given some leadership responsibility so that they can make the mistakes that they're going to make and
Hmm.
learn from those mistakes.
Yeah, yeah, you're not just a leader in your 9 to 5 job, but there's other opportunities to be leaders, whether in your family or your community or the different areas that you live in around you and work in. So I think that's, yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. And so what inspires you to found Leadership Squared and what is its core mission?
When I was in my corporate world about now 12 years ago, I was the director of global training and development for a clinical research firm, a drug trials firm
Hmm.
that was acquired by another drug trials firm that already had a director of global leadership and development. So, in
Mm,
the words of Cincinnati football coach Paul Brown, I was invited to move along with my life's work, whatever that
mm-hmm.
might be.
Mm-hmm.
So, at the time, the time was right for us to do that. My children were grown and gone. My wife had her own business. Our money and expenses were not an issue. So I asked my wife, I think I can do this. Do you mind if I give it a try? And she's, what the heck? Go for it. So,
Mm-hmm.
I've started doing that. And I think like a lot of business owners, a lot of entrepreneurs, I started off trying to be everything to everybody. But
Mm,
since then, I've learned to focus on a couple key things like Clifton strengths and strengths in general, and to focus more on some specific industry segments like professional associations and educational associations.
mm-hmm. I see. Okay. Um, yeah. So are you working with a certain leadership population or teams or certain leadership level? Like, do you specialize in one of those areas?
Typically, I tend to work more with emerging leaders. So first and second level supervisors and
Mm-hmm.
managers.
Okay.
I
Mm-hmm.
also work
Awesome.
with a lot of professionals who are trying to develop their leadership skills, like doctors and lawyers. But I like to do that more in groups, so in presentations or small
Mm-hmm.
groups as opposed to individual coaching.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's amazing. I'm sure you're doing some awesome work. And then you're teaching as well. So tell me how you balance it all. I'm like living a little bit in academia. Does it energize you for the work that you do? How do you manage that balance?
I think all of these things relate to each other and they
Mm-hmm.
reinforce each other. So one of my Clifton strengths is adaptability, and kind of the counterpart to that is focus. The example I use in time management, the Stephen Covey approach is the urgency importance matrix, right? You figure out what's important and what's urgent, and you focus on that until you get it all cleaned out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't work that way. I need a variety. I need to be able to switch gears during my day and during my week. So
Mm.
the ability to do a lot of different things I find to be very energizing. So I think that helps me be more productive.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's really applicable for any listener who's on the back end of the PhD or graduated and kind of figuring out how to because I think there's so much opportunity now. Like you can teach a little or you can work in industry. You don't have to do one or the other. And so how do you manage that or how do you decide? And I think it's understanding what works for you and knowing your strengths. So
Right. At my age too, I have a lot of people tell me, Dan, I want to be like you when I grow up because I just do a lot of different things. And, I'm not going to become filthy rich at any of the things that I'm doing. But again, that's not my motivation. And so I
mm.
just do things that I find interesting. And when they cease to be interesting, I like to find a way to gracefully exit from that project and move on to something that is more interesting.
Yeah, and when you focus on that, like if that's your goal, do you think those things like they come to you like you're not having to, do something that makes you unhappy, I guess, when that's your goal?
I do because I think there's so many people that need so much help with so much stuff. If you exhibit any willingness to help them or to listen to them and say, I think that there's a way that you can get past this obstacle, and here's a suggestion.
Mm,
People are generally interested in that. So it's just a matter of not being focused on what you want to do, but being focused more on what people need you to do, but people or
mm,
organizations need you to do.
mm-hmm.
And, it's not selling yourself. It's telling people what you're kind of interested in, what your capabilities are. And if there's a match, you can exploit that match. And if there's not, just move on, right?
Yeah, being open to those opportunities and providing value within those spaces for
Exactly.
sure.
Yes, exactly.
So if you were mentoring a current PhD student who wanted to transition into leadership development right now, what advice would you give them?
Boy, I had not thought of that, but I think that the key would be to look at the leaders in the fields that you're most interested in. So, for example, if you're in a PhD program now, look at the people who are in your department who really have leadership roles, and how do they get those leadership roles? How do they maintain those? I think most of the time it's not the title that they have, it's the knowledge and expertise that they brought to the job that led them to the title that they have. So, how did they find the niche that they're exploiting? How did they develop their expertise in that niche? What do people come to them looking for? What problems are they solving for other people? Because that's what a leader does. And so you as a student would have to ask yourself, well, do I have specific knowledge or skills or strengths that I can help other people solve problems? And then ask people what those problems are and find out what you can do to serve them. And that's where your leadership opportunities will come from.
Yeah, staying open, being mindful and aware of what's around you at the given time to see if that's a good fit for you. Would you recommend it? Would you recommend a PhD student to look into getting into the field of leadership development?
I would say I would not necessarily recommend that. I wouldn't discourage that, but I would say if you're committed to getting a PhD, you better stay, again, going back to my three questions, you better find a topic that can keep you warm when the cold nights happen. It has to be
Yeah.
something that's interesting to you. So for some people, that might be questions of leadership and what makes a good leader and how good leaders become great leaders. For other people, it might be how can people who are not fully functioning in society become at least contributing members of society?
Hmm.
Leadership might be off the table for them, but
Hmm.
being a great individual contributor might be something that society needs. And if
Mm,
that's what interests you as a student, focus on that. So, again, I think leadership development is a great field of study. There are many great career opportunities in it, but
hmm.
only if you as an individual are interested in pursuing those.
Yeah, I love that. I love coming back to that framework because you can kind of use that for some other life decisions, not just your dissertation, right?
You,
Like,
you probably can.
so that's a great one. That's awesome. All right, Dan, I have two final questions that I ask each of my guests. And the first one is, what is one book, podcast, or article that every PhD student should read or listen to when they are in their program?
I think for every PhD student, I would recommend The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, first of all. I think that really introduced the whole concept of paradigms to me, which I found to be very insightful and valuable.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite book in my current leadership development activities that I recommend to everyone is It's Your Ship by Mike Ebershoff. And it's the story of a captain who turned around the worst performing ship in the U.S. Navy. And 3 years later, it was the best ship in the U.S. Navy. And it really came about because he developed leadership among his sailors. His message was, we're all in this together. So what can we do as a team to make this ship work more effectively. So
Mm.
those two books, I think, are the two that I would recommend to anyone.
Yeah, fantastic. I will link to those and both seem relevant for a PhD student, whether wherever they're going to learn those
Yeah.
skills. That sounds quite interesting. It's your ship. So I will link to that. And final question, if you could give yourself, your younger self, one piece of advice before starting your PhD, what would it be?
I think that I would have benefited from spending some time in the workforce
Mm,
before I started my PhD journey, just to become more aware of what the real needs of people and society are.
mm-hmm.
You know, I'm sure I had a naive view when I was a 20-year-old college graduate, and moving right from there into the life of a graduate student didn't really open my eyes very much either. So I
Mm,
think getting some practical real world experience is something I would recommend to anyone, no matter what
mm.
their career aspirations are.
Fantastic. Is there a sweet spot for it? Because some folks will just go through, right? Academia.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, some people are very successful at doing it. I would have been more successful if I had taken that break
Yeah.
and gotten some more exposure. In
Mm-hmm.
my own, I have three sons, and all three of them spent time in the military when they finished college. And I think they would all say that was a great experience for them.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the military is not for everyone, but something that has a real world component to it would be valuable for anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's, I think, great insight. So, Dan, this has been a very insightful conversation. I think your journey from a PhD at 20 to here you are now doing some great things in leadership development with top organizations. So it's really inspiring. So thank you so much for sharing wisdom, experience with us today. Before I wrap up, where can people like connect with you or follow your work?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, so Dan Hiltz on LinkedIn. You can follow me at leadershipsquared.com as my website. Feel free to put my email in the link to this podcast as well. You know, I love talking about this stuff, so if people have questions, I'm always available to try to help them come up with an answer. Okay.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much again, Dan, for being here and for your time today.
Thank you so much for extending the invitation to me. As we talked before the broadcast started, we have some shared connections professionally, and
Yeah.
I look fondly on the time that I spent where you are now, and I think that's a great career move for you. I know that you're a great asset to them, and I'm sure that your experience there is valuable to you in your leadership development practice as well.
Yeah, no doubt. It is feels like a gift sometimes. So
That's
absolutely
great.
agree. What an awesome conversation with Dr. Dan Hiltz, who has really an amazing career that has evolved over time from earning his PhD to getting into the field of leadership development and becoming an entrepreneur and staying in academia and still being an instructor. I think my biggest takeaway is list that you provided, the framework, the list of topics, how to choose your topic for your dissertation, which is you have to have interest in it first and foremost. Second off, others need to be interested in it so that it can have some legs there. And then three, that you have to have access to the data. And I feel like this is applicable beyond topics for the dissertation, but maybe in any area of your career that you are in, thinking about these things that it interests you, it interests others, and that there's data or things to work with. So amazing conversation. What resonated with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop me a message or a comment. Thank you for tuning in to Connected today. You can find all of the links in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone in your PhD community. And be sure to follow along on LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube for more conversations just like this. So I will hopefully see you next time, and let's stay connected.